Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, July 31st, 2024. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, where we believe in better broadband, better lives. We want higher capacity internet services for everyone and want to see the things that come from having that higher capacity internet, how it impacts people's lives, how it enables the kinds of applications, services, things we may not even be aware of consciously so much. It's a busy time, even though we're in the middle of summer, almost towards the late part of summer in August, and there's actually been kind of conferences going on every which way. In part because of the political season, we had the Republican National Convention. We had a Broadband Breakfast reporter, Joel Layton, at that conference. Right now, Fiber Connect is going on, and we've got Broadband Breakfast reporter Jake Neenan at Fiber Connect reporting from there. I'll be out next week in Denver at Mountain Connect, and then later in August, they will be the Democratic National Convention, and Broadband Breakfast will be there too, reporting on the interplay of politics and technology as it impacts this world. We are also super excited about the upcoming Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. This is the 6th event that we have done on an annual basis. It will be on Thursday, September 19th here in Washington, D.C. Information is available on broadbandbreakfast.com/DII for digital infrastructure investment. You can see all the information about it. We're going to be posting the agenda later this week, but you still can pre-register for $195, and that will go up later after the early bird rate ends. And I would be remiss if I didn't also thank Ted Hearn, our managing editor, who did a fabulous job last week while I was off at Scout Camp moderating our discussion of the Universal Service Fund. Very meaty topic, very substantive, a lot of issues. Similarly to this one, we're going to be talking today about junk fees, as they're called. We're not necessarily agreeing with that term, but that's what a lot of people are calling them. And today we're going to talk about junk fees and affordable connectivity. Actually, there's a main headline, which is it's all about costs, right? And costs are a very important part of broadband, right? We can't forget that, right? Because there are a lot of people who want broadband and have access to broadband, but can't get it because they can't afford it. And which raises another topic, the Affordable Connectivity Program, which we've also covered quite extensively. And sad to see that end, but I think maybe it will be brought back to life like Lazarus. So we'll see. We'll see about that. We'll see in what form the ACP takes. But it's related very much so to this topic we're talking about today about costs, about so-called junk fees, about affordable connectivity. We got a great panel to do it. Before I turn to our panel, though, I want to give a shout out to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do this programming. We do free programming 4.5 years now. Every single week, we've done some substantive topic on better broadband, better lives. And we couldn't do this without the support of our Broadband Breakfast sponsors. They include Utopia Fiber, Comcast, SmartWave Technologies, Ookla, Wesco, Coos Systems, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Broadband Networks Initiative, the California Emerging Technology Fund, G-Fiber, Broadband Now, Tirana Wireless, WISPA, Broadband Without Boundaries, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Thank you to each of our sponsors. Well, now let me go ahead and open up our view to our panel. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. We have got hopefully a lot of points of view here. I'm not 100% sure of their particular points of view, but I look forward to hearing them on costs, on so-called junk fees, on affordable connectivity, and let's dive right in. So first, we're going to hear from Brian Hurley, Chief Regulatory Counsel at ACA Connects. Brian, in that role, oversees and coordinates ACA Connect's advocacy on legal and regulatory matters, as well as its educational programming for members. And before joining ACA Connects, he was an attorney with the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. We also will hear from NATOA, the national, well, let me introduce him. Mike Lynch is the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Director at the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, NATOA, not to be confused with NATO. I'm sure you get that a lot, Mike, right?
A little bit.
A little bit. So NATOA, very important group that maybe isn't on the tip of the tongue for people, but they are responsible for the Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors who work on a local level, right? So in his role as Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Director, Mike advances policy positions, advocacy, legislative, strategic development, and tracks and analyzes federal and state telecom policy. He's a longtime board member, past president, and treasurer of the group, and works closely with local government, cable, and public educational and government folks in cities, towns, and counties. He's also worked a lot on wireless siting issues, broadband planning and funding, digital inclusion, digital equity and inclusion issues, as well as rights of way policies. So thanks for being with us, Mike. Following Mike, we're going to hear from John Bergmeyer, who is the legal director of public knowledge. And I probably should have mentioned, we did an event with public knowledge about 3.5 months ago. It was a lot of fun. It was working with public knowledge on a rally to protect the Affordable Connectivity Program. And obviously we're not there yet, but let's see if we can get Lazarus back from the dead here. But anyway, John is as the legal director of public knowledge, he specializes in telecom, internet, and intellectual property issues. He advocates for the public interest before courts and policymakers and works to make sure all stakeholders, including ordinary citizens, artists, technological innovators, have a say in shaping digital policies. And lastly, but not least, is Mark Jameson. Mark's a repeat guest here on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Thank you for being with us before. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on how technology affects the economy and the federal communications and telecom issues. He is currently director and Gunter Professor of Public Utility Research of the Public Utility Research Center at the University of Florida's Washington College of Business, and he was on the FCC transition team for President-elect Trump in 2020. So with that, let's go ahead and open the floor up to Brian. What is your thoughts on our topic today?
Oh, well, thank you, Drew, and thank you to my frozen here. Sorry. Thank you, Drew, and thank you to Broadband Breakfast for the invitation. And Drew, I really like how you teed this up. There are a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives on these issues, and just because a particular fee or a practice gets lumped in with the junk fees concept, that doesn't necessarily mean that the moniker is a good fit in any particular case. And to provide some quick context for my remarks, my trade association, ACA Connects, we represent more than 500 small and mid-sized communications providers. Our members provide an array of services that includes broadband, cable, voice telephony. They operate primarily in rural and smaller suburban markets across America, and they enable their communities to enjoy advanced services and high-speed connectivity that rivals what's available in any metropolitan area. They provide broadband service in an arena that's intensely and increasingly competitive. The vast majority of households that they pass have at least 3 options for big fixed broadband service, often 4 or more. And as competition intensifies, it's consumers that see the benefits in terms of increased speeds, lower prices per megabit, better, more reliable service. Our members have strong roots in the communities they serve. Many of them are small family businesses. They hold themselves to high standards of honesty and transparency in their dealings with customers and potential customers who are often their friends and neighbors. And that means disclosing sufficient information about their offerings so that consumers can select the services that are right for them and within their budget. Also, in this competitive marketplace, our members and other providers have every incentive to avoid bill shock and other negative experiences that could compel their customers to take their business elsewhere to a competitor. And they're also eager to tout their low prices, new technologies, and other aspects of their offerings that may differentiate them from their competitors. Accordingly, our members don't embrace the junk fees label that some would like to cast upon them. This is a term that's gained a lot of attention and notoriety lately, and perhaps in some cases that attention is warranted, but it's not a good fit for our members and their practices and the services they offer. And to help illustrate that point, it's worth, I think, examining the proposed rule from the Federal Trade Commission, which would ban so-called junk fees, kind of across the economy. If you look at the analysis that underlies that proposal, it focuses on problems in a handful of industries, such as the live ticketing industry, not the communications industry, not broadband. There's no finding that junk fees are prevalent in those industries and markets. And even if there were some concern about junk fees in the broadband sector, all broadband providers are now required, or soon will be required, to display nutrition labels for their broadband offerings. And these labels must be displayed at every point of sale, including on the website, and they must contain specific pricing information. In particular, they must include the base monthly price for the service and separately list any additional taxes and fees, itemized monthly fees, one-time fees at purchase, any early termination fees or data overage charges. Those need to be included as well. And the labels include links to a web page where consumers can learn more about discounts and bundles that may be available. So that's a comprehensive set of pricing information that is at or will be at every consumer's fingertips when they're shopping and comparing for broadband offerings. To be clear, these labels didn't introduce transparency for the first time, but they did build on a strong foundation of existing practices by providing an additional tool to help consumers shop and compare offerings. And this is all, again, occurring against the backdrop of a broadband marketplace that's intensely and increasingly competitive. And consumers are ultimately the ones who benefit from that competition. So I'll stop there. I look forward to getting into some of the questions later in the session.
Great, wonderful. One quick thing I forgot to mention earlier is that Broadband Breakfast produced a report earlier this year. In fact, it was just last month on understanding, quote, junk fees in broadband. And I'll put the link to that in the chat window. Reminder to ask questions in the Q&A tab. That's available for Broadband Breakfast members, and we certainly encourage you to join. I may say a word or two more about that later on, but just wanted to mention that we've dug deeply into this topic and hope many of you will take advantage of that research and report. All right, let's go to our next speaker, Mike Lynch.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having us. And congratulations on being able to pronounce National Telecommunications Officers and Advisors so easily as you just did. 40 years in, we still have to find a new name. That's just way too long. As you pretty much summarized, our membership includes local government officials and staff members from cities, towns, counties, even joint power authorities across the country, whose responsibility it is to advise and implement telecommunications and broadband policy and provision of services in those towns, in those communities. It was a lot easier years ago because we had cable regulation. Simple things like pricing were very easy to determine. Rates were clearly established, debated, argued constantly. I think you know that for many years, too many years probably, I was the Boston cable guy. And in Boston back in the 80s, Cablevision came to town, and their hook to get built in the city was, we're going to give you a $2 basic. Well, I mean, it was not sustainable. So they started with it, and I'll tell you that when I left 2 years ago, we would still have some senior citizens calling and saying, whatever happened to my $2 basic? It's long gone. So this has constantly been a challenge. It's an evolving industry of broadband and cable. Our constituency, our members, we loved the regulatory environment, which gave us a chance to divine what was behind the pricing and gave us a chance to be responsive to our communities. It's a lot harder today. We welcomed, you mentioned your report last month. I think that was also the third anniversary of President Biden's executive order, which kind of implemented this march to transparency on what he called and what they called junk fees at the time. And I think it's been great. NTOA welcomes the proceedings that have been happening. at the Federal Communications Commission. We support them, as does Public Knowledge. Also on here, I see you have a very balanced panel, so we're bound to have a very interesting conversation. We love it. Personally, I'd like to see more things thrown in there. I'm ready to talk about broadcast fees and regional sports fees anytime you want. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and it's great to again sort of see the perspective. Maybe we will get into sort of the TV world. Obviously, we've gotten pulled into the TV world because broadband is the universal pipe, right? And so
that's right.
That's where everything's going. And so obviously, different regulatory structures were built because of different technologies. And while NATOA may have been kind of built because of the cable model, clearly you've adapted and
we're unabashed at using that cable hook to advocate for broadband. As you know, broadband is unregulated. So it's the little bit of the Wild West as things evolve. And I think what's being done in the Biden administration and in today's Federal Communications Commission is just an attempt at transparency and honesty and clarity for the consumer, and we welcome that.
Wonderful. All right, let's turn to John Bergmeyer. What are your thoughts on this issue and pricing for broadband in general?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, I'd like to thank Mike because we're very much in alignment on this point. I would say, this has been just much broader than just broadband and much broader than just cable. Obviously, the Biden administration put out an EO addressing like competition and consumer protection issues throughout the economy. The FTC has its rulemaking on junk fees. Prior to the advent of this term, junk fees, I think in the cable and broadband context, we had been saying below the line fees. I think junk fees is supposed to be a little bit of a broader concept, as below the line fees were just sort of unadvertised fees that like show up on your bill and you're like, wait, what's this? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a part of the service. And I'd always even going back years had said this is if you go to McDonald's and you buy a hamburger and then it costs twice as much because it's like, oh, you didn't know about the bun fee, the sesame fee, you didn't know about the health department compliance charge, you didn't know about the labor cost deduction. But honestly, I used to use that as like an absurd example, but like around DC, I see exactly that being added onto restaurant bills. I went to a restaurant pretty recently and there was on the bill there was like an inflation charge, it's designed to reflect like the increased cost of their inputs, which to me just strikes me as like completely ridiculous. The costs that are supposed to be just built into your price from the beginning, and if your costs go up, your prices go up. That's just how it works. I think there's the advantages to taking decisive action against these sorts of fees. It's not just price, but it's also just consumer fairness. People feel like they're getting ripped off. It's unexpected, and it's hard to see how you can have a market truly function if people don't really have awareness of how much things cost until after they have committed to buy it. So in addition to the FTC and Biden administration, I think the FCC has done some interesting stuff. It has the all-in pricing rule, which PK and we filed comments along with Consumer Reports last year, fully supporting it, and we think that's great. Maybe it's a little tangential, but the FCC is currently looking at the bulk billing issue, which is sort of related. And then the FCC's proceeding on early termination fees and billing cycle fees for in video service. And in the Fifth Circuit's recent ruling on the constitutionality, the en banc ruling on the constitutionality of USF, there's actually some discussion there about whether or not USF fees are taxes on consumers or whether they're just sort of passed through below the line fees on consumers. And obviously, I believe it's the latter, that they're charges on telecom providers who are authorized but not required to separately itemize them out. So, I highly support, and I think it's great that the administration, the FCC and the FTC have been taking action against these fees in a lot of respects, not just in the broadband and cable issues that we all know, but in ticketing and hotels and restaurants and delivery services. I would say it's certainly not a broadband specific problem, but my attention to it certainly first came about through seeing these mystery meat charges on bills in the broadband and telecom context.
Well, again, great. There may be a sort of inevitable tendency to look at other industries, right? I mean, like flying on airplanes as one example of this. I mean, like we used to expect things for free, and then discount airlines come along and they charge for a bag, they charge for a seat, and I think, I mean, we could get into an economic discussion of the merits of pricing. I think that the core philosophical fairness point that John's made is, are you hitting the consumer with something after they've already committed to the purchase, right? That's a great point, a great frame for the point. And Mark, you're an economist, I believe, right? So I don't know if you have any economic lens that you can put on this, but let's turn the time over to you for a few minutes to give us your thoughts on this issue, and then we'll round robin it with everyone. So go ahead, Mark.
All right. Well, thank you, Drew. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and be on your program. Congratulations on your success over the past 4.5 years. It's been, I guess. A lot of people have tried to do what you're doing and haven't been able to pull it off. And I suspect people will keep trying, but that's the way the market works. Congratulations. You're doing things that people really, really value. And then I am honored to be with this panel. There's really knowledgeable expert people here. As I think about this particular issue, I'm reminded of an experience I had at the University of Florida a few years ago. One of our higher up finance officers concluded that those of us in faculty and staff positions weren't paying enough attention to what it really cost to buy a computer, to buy computer equipment like printers and such as that. So he tried to implement what he called a full cost requirement. So if I wanted to, or anybody else in my organizations wanted to buy computer equipment, we'd have to go through a lot of different comparisons and calculations. We had to estimate how long we were going to use this particular equipment, what the maintenance was going to be over time, what the supply costs were going to be over time. And there were a lot of other factors in that. The idea behind it was good, that people should make informed decisions. And that's what I think, guessing a little bit, underlies what the White House is trying to do, what the Federal Communications Commission might be trying to do. But it's a lot harder than it seems. So he worked on this for like 2 years and finally threw up his hands and just said, I can't do this. And he couldn't do it because each of us had different things within that price cost comparison. And how could he have a uniform rule that was going to apply to everyone? And that just didn't work. It also built into it an assumption that was a main consideration, what the financial outlay over time was going to be. And sometimes it was when you're operating on a budget, but sometimes there are a whole lot of other factors that worked into our decision making as well. And then, of course, there's the underlying assumption that those rules are a lot smarter than the buyers, which doesn't really play out too well. Buyers tend to figure stuff out and know what they're doing. It takes a little time, but that is the case. As I think about then, what is for example, just the Federal Communications Commission trying to do? Would I do that in their situation? And I probably would not. Over time, I used to be a telecommunications regulator way back when, and now a lot of my work is going around the world and helping train people who work in these regulatory fields. I appreciate the complexity and the difficulty of trying to make sure that consumers have the information that they need. But it sometimes just doesn't work to tell them, here's what you get, and here's what you're supposed to be paying attention to when you make that decision. For one reason, we're probably going to be wrong on what they want to consider. We're probably not going to be able to provide something that's exactly their situation, their scenario. For example, in Florida, the Public Service Commission that regulates the electric utilities publishes once a year, here's what the electric bills are across the different types of utilities that we have. And it turns out the price comparisons just don't fit anyone, actually. They have to come up with a representative and no one actually is that. So it's hard to make those kinds of comparisons. And then also what I would be thinking about if I had been at the FCC or at the FCC doing this is if I highlight price, if I say that is what I want people to pay attention to, then I've lowered the customer's cost of figuring that out. But then I've made other things that the customer is going to be worried about more expensive relative to looking at that. So I'm zeroing in then the customer's focus on price, which might not be what's really most important to them. But I've also then distorted the industry's incentives because the industry now knows everybody's going to look at price. And there are other things that are a little harder to see that then become less important. And that's where quality might drop or other things will be left behind because the customers just aren't choosing based upon that. So those are my thoughts, and I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mark, for that economics perspective, I believe, to the subject. And I want to zero in on a question I've already shared with you all, which is how expensive is broadband in the United States versus other OECD countries? Have any of your organizations looked at this? And what do you think the latest on American broadband versus other countries, and for that matter, American broadband in itself over time and the rise of costs in broadband? Who would like to take this question?
I can get us started by pleading ignorance on some aspects of that. It's really hard to compare prices across jurisdictions. And even if I could have a price that is representative of the US versus representative of France or England or Sweden or wherever else it might be, what that price represents is very different across the countries. The cost of providing service is really different in all different places in the US, let alone in Germany versus broadly across the US. So I tend to not make those kinds of comparisons. We did do some comparisons, looked at other people's studies, in fact, on kind of what is being delivered. This was especially prominent in our work during COVID, because suddenly everybody was online and everybody was depending upon being online. And we wondered, how did the networks fare? In that case, the US networks fared very well compared to their counterparts across the oceans and other parts of the world as well. So I conclude that looks like customers are getting a lot of value from for their money from their perspective. Are they getting as much value as somebody else? That's really hard to know.
We did have a discussion of this at our broadband measurement summit about 4 months ago. And I've just put in the link for our Zoom viewers. We have viewers on other platforms, and I'll share this on the page for this event. But in that discussion, it was raised, like pricing is kind of the missing variable, right? I mean, we're involved in this massive effort to collect information about broadband availability, and speeds are now a little bit more included in that discussion. Prices are a bit of the missing piece, right? And there are some reasons for that, some good reasons for it, but there are also some bad reasons for that. And again, I come back to, how much is to the extent junk fees is gaining traction in the broadband world, is it a proxy for concern about rising broadband prices? What do you, Brian, what do you hear from your members? I mean, have your members raised prices, or have they kept them constant or lowered them? John, what do you hear as you interact with other kind of consumer and public advocates? Is this a hot button issue the way the price of meat is a hot button issue, or less so?
Yeah, I mean, of course, all providers are a little different, but I mean, I think we've generally seen over time, broadband prices, especially when you compare them to prices of other essential commodities, energy or gasoline, broadband prices tend to hold up pretty well. You see lower prices per meg, and there are other ways of measuring that. The price for the most popular service, the price for the fastest service, and we've seen decreases on those metrics as well. I would push back on sort of trying to link these concepts of junk fees and pricing. And part of that, I think when you're looking at the communications industry, it's worth kind of taking stock of how heavily regulated it is in when it comes to pricing transparency, at least certainly when taking into account sort of recent actions. We talked about broadband labels. I think Mike and John both touched on the all-in pricing, which applies on the video side, and that actually builds upon the Television Viewer Protection Act, which was adopted in 2019, which also imposed pricing disclosure requirements on cable providers. So there are obligations that apply at the time of at the point during advertisements. That's under the all-in rule. There's obligations that apply at the point of sale. After customer agrees to purchase the video service, there's a 24-hour period where they get all the information, and then they can decide to rescind their acceptance. And then there's disclosures that come on the monthly bills under both of those regimes. And then you also have truth in billing requirements that apply on the common carrier, your voice side. So I think there's a lot. Whatever your thoughts are, sort of what the baseline level of transparency may have been, I think it was already pretty high to begin with. We have seen a lot of effort from the FCC in particular recently to kind of further regulate in this area.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. Comparing broadband pricing internationally or just the United States to other OECD countries is very complex. The United States does seem to come out as relatively expensive, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of income. But then, of course, what you're buying is different. There are a lot of factors. I think that the main connection between junk fees or below the line fees and broadband pricing is less whether it is the driver of absolute cost of broadband in the United States. It's just a way to raise prices on the sly for companies to collect more money through the introduction of new fees that are not listed as part of the service price without seeming to do so. So I think they're connected in that respect. For sure. And that is certainly what we hear. We hear people just complaining about rising bills and feeling like they are deceived because the prices are simply just not included in the service cost. And just to distinguish, I mean, to me, the worst offenders in terms of these fees would just be fees that are the same for everyone. They don't vary from place to place, and they're mandatory. So it's not like it's an optional add-on that you can get. Most people get it, but you actually don't have to, like maybe a cable modem rental or something, where it's like you could theoretically get your own, or there's or the airline example you mentioned, where it's like, look, I actually do fly on Frontier quite a bit, and I don't check any bags because I'm doing it for such a short time. So things like that are annoying. Maybe there's a consumer protection problem. That strikes me as quite different from a fee that you have no choice but to pay. Everyone pays the same fee, and yet it is not listed in the advertised price, and you don't necessarily even find out about it until your bill. Coupled with the fact that sometimes they're just framed deceptively. They're just framed, I think it is totally legitimate and wonderful for providers to itemize out and to explain to consumers, here's where your money is going. You're a cable provider. Hey, look how much money you're paying for ESPN. This is good information for consumers to have, even if there's not really a way to avoid it. What I find the worst is when these sorts of fees are not listed, and then they're sort of characterized as some sort of like mandatory charge or as a tax, or it's like, oh, we're legally required to charge this to you, and none of that is almost ever true. And I think
let me ask Brian. I want to get Brian's reaction to this, because I think you're zeroing in on a key point here that maybe is distinct from other add-on fees. Is something you're required to pay, but it's not kind of framed correctly or presented ahead of the purchase. Brian, what do you say to John's points on those?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd go back to my earlier point that there is a lot of regulation in this area that kind of limits providers' ability to do that kind of pricing. I think maybe one issue we've been kind of circling around, I think Mike raised it, was the broadcast TV retransmission consent fees, and that's certainly a big issue for ACA Connects and our members. They've suffered for years under the high and increasing retransmission consent fees that they're hit with each time they go to renew their agreements, their massive increases, and also other onerous terms and conditions that they're required to comply with. I think I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it's something like they've increased industry-wide 5,000% since 2006 or something. Don't quote me on that exactly, but it's somewhere in that order of magnitude.
Do most of your members itemize that and say retransmission consent fee? What are the pros and cons of doing that?
Members do different things, but I think some members like to break that out so customers understand what the source is of the increasing prices that they're seeing on their bills, that this isn't something where their cable operators trying to sort of bilk them out of extra money. This is just, this dysfunctional marketplace in which they're having to purchase their, carriage rights and sort of, build that into the price of the, the service offering. And I will say that was one, we thought, we thought the all-in pricing order, we'd come out against that. We'd prefer us to focus on taking action to actually address the underlying dysfunction in the market. But I will say we were pleased that the order does preserve the ability of cable operators, MVPDs, to continue to break out the broadcast television fee in addition to the required disclosures, which we think only increases the transparency of the billing for the consumer.
Okay. Well, Mike, you're the one.
On this point, though.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I just think it's just sort of worth pointing out that public knowledge, we're actually pretty broadly aligned with Brian and ACA and the cable industry on the ridiculous increasing costs of retransmission fees. We think that something should be done about it. Like absolutely, it is terrible that would be a driver of increasing cost to consumers. But at the same time, all that being said, if labor market tightens and all of a sudden you have to pay technicians more, if real estate prices go up, if any number of inputs to the service increase, that just means you raise your prices. You can explain to customers, it's like, we hate to do this, we're not keeping this money. That's wonderful, but it's still part of the service that you're charging for. So to me, that's the key distinction. It's not just correctly identifying what people are paying, but it's simply not including it into the base cost of the service. If the cost of the service goes up, it goes up. You can't hide from that.
I think I just want to say, as you're talking about fees, broadcast fees, let's say, as you just mentioned them, I think one of the sort of matches on this was a 2019 report from Consumer Reports, which said that there was something like $28 billion in hidden fees and cable bills back at that time. It's 5 years later now. We know that it has greatly increased. The challenge, I think, and I know, Drew, this is really about broadband, but cable is an integral part of it, right? And the challenge on the broadcast fees, the underpinning of cable broadband is cable TV. And if you're charging, for a standard package, something like $30, and then doubling that with two mandatory fees, the regional sports fee and a broadcast fee, it becomes cost prohibitive. You're actually suggesting to people, you're over-the-air news, your local over-the-air news, which you could get with an antenna for free if you were able to do so. We're going to charge you $60 a month for it. People just say, I don't understand. So that transparency, I think, is what the consumer is looking for. Look, the broadband label is a great idea. It's only for broadband. It is not showing up for cable TV. In addition, it came from the concept of a nutrition label, but it could have very easily been when people began to get overwhelmed with the pricing of cars and the MSRP label. It's just about transparency and honesty, I think, to consumers.
I just have to quickly push back on one thing there. Just that I think the Consumers Report study from 2018 actually informed Congress's adoption of the 2019 Television Viewer Protection Act, and that law actually imposes on cable operators, transparency requirements that I think get at the concerns you raise, including disclosing information and at the point of sale, before the customer enters is on the hook to purchase their service.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are stuck in a bad spot. I understand that the retransmission costs are probably prohibitive for you, but 8-9 years ago it was $1 a month for the consumer. Today it is it's probably $25 on one and another $8 or $10 on another. It has become enormous, and you can say to me as a consumer or city licensor that this is retransmission burden from others, but there's no transparency. There's no evidence of that. We have to take it on faith, and it's a pretty big number to take on faith.
Mark,
Could I
go
add
ahead.
a couple of
Very
things,
patient
please?
here. Good, Mark.
Okay, so one of there seem to be some assumptions oftentimes in these kinds of discussions. One is that what we see today is what will be for foreseeable future, but we know from other industries, we've discussed the airline industry as an example. It's very dynamic what the price structures are. Airlines have moved from one type of price structure, some of them moved to another, now they're moving to a different one. And it's all driven by how do we actually keep customers buying from us? How do we get them to buy from us? How do we keep them buying from us? And that was one thing that I think is important as well. And that is when we talk about these extra fees, and if we talk about them as hidden fees, they're only hidden if they are when the customer is first trying to make a price comparison. Once the customer starts paying the bill, they know exactly what those fees are. They're not hidden anymore by then. Should companies be transparent and say, here's what your bill will be? Certainly. But it's a different thing to say, well, the government should write that script and say, here's what you should be telling the customers. Then one other thing that is often an assumption as well, and I think this was in the Consumer Reports investigation, or at least in their conclusions, and that is if these fees were to go away, customers would save money. As I talk with government officials all over the world, we have these kinds of discussions about what are the customers having to pay. And governments will say they shouldn't have to pay for this, they shouldn't have to pay for that. And one thing that I explain to them is that investors move their money from place to place. And you can tell the investor you're not going to be able to receive this revenue. And they will say, well, that's no longer enough. And they will move their money elsewhere. At the end of the day, whatever cash flow the investors need, the customers will pay for it, whether it's through one price, 10 prices, whatever it might be. That is what will happen. So if we say you can't charge these prices, at the end of the day, we're not going to save customers any money.
So, Mark, we've got a question, and we got a lot of questions. It's great. One for you particularly says, what are you advocating doing? Are you advocating doing nothing, or do you have a recommendation for improving transparency for consumers, Mark?
Well, I don't have a recommendation for improving transparency because I'm an academic. I don't have enough evidence to know that there is a lack of transparency that is causing problems. Certainly there are things that people don't know, but there are costs then of trying to have customers know this. Cost for the customers, cost for the industry, cost for the government as well. I don't have enough information to say, here's what I would do. I might just do nothing, say this is as good as it's going to get, which a lot of people don't like, but oftentimes it's true.
Let me ask another question. This is from Michael Pitch. Should promotional discounts be considered a delayed junk fee? And I know you're going to say something, Mark, but I want to hear what other people say about this. And Brian, maybe you want to react as well. So who wants to take this question of, are promotional discounts a delayed fee?
Well, I mean, I'll just start. It would be counterintuitive to me if offering a discount is a problematic fee. I understand there are concerns around disclosing sort of the terms of promotions and sort of when they when they end and what the terms are. But I think providers generally do that, and in any event, there are regulations and different services that get into that.
Maybe Mike can give us, you've kind of voiced some empathy here for Brian's dilemma here. What are you saying he should do?
Not too much.
Not too much. What are you saying that cable and broadband and other entities should be doing? Like, how much is the right disclosure? And we've kind of had tension here because there's this quote unquote all-in requirement, but then John is saying, well, actually, I'd like to have it broken out so people can see what the costs are. So Mike, as you kind of have had to interface as a local government official, where do you come down on the level of disclosure that is right?
Well, I honestly don't know. I think mostly what we're advocating for is transparency. You know, one might say a little more honesty in pricing may give people an opportunity to shop around. That might work for wireless, but it's not necessarily going to work for broadband. We don't have that much competition, right? You have it in big cities and not a lot of other places, I would guess, right? So that's a bit of a challenge. I know we sort of drifted off and we're talking about cable, but as another example, let's talk briefly about broadband by cable. And one of the fees that they include usually is a rental fee for a modem. I think John mentioned it earlier. I recently moved after 30 years, and I was shocked to see what was in my bill. And one of the items that was in my bill was not only a rental fee, but kind of a prorated going forward refresh fee. So today I'm paying extra for a modem that I might get in 3 years if I'm still with the company. That's, I don't know if it's a hidden fee or it's just a surprise fee, but it kind of shocked me.
Yeah, and I don't really see any tension between the concept of all-in pricing, even beyond the FCC's proposal, and billing transparency to the extent it's possible. It's just a matter of how do you allocate the fees? Are you including it and then saying, oh, this is what you're paying, oh, and here's how it breaks down, versus here's what you're paying, and oh, here's all these other fees. So I think that's a very important distinction. And then as to promotions, it's really easy to say, okay, here's the clearest example of what would be the kind of below the line fee that I think is unacceptable. But with promotions, you'd have to see a specific example. I could see how it's done fine. I can see how it's done in a deceptive way. So it's really hard to make like a blanket statement.
We've got a lot of questioners raising their own favorite junk fees, right? Bert Cohen says, how does the consumer know that a company's broadband fee accurately reflects actual retransmission consent charges? We have another, I think it's actually Bert as well. He says there's a network enhancement fee. Okay, so I mean, again, in some ways, this you can see why this is popular, right? Because just it's funny. It's funny to see all of the fees that someone will come up with, right? So maybe we have a more serious conversation about it. I mean, John, I know I'm coming back to the same issue you just said, but like, in some ways, I guess the question is, what is the benefit to the consumer of seeing or not seeing X number of inputs into the bill versus this is the price, right? And consumers can make a choice about it. Like, I love being able to go to the grocery store and choose lots and lots of things, and you can put something in and take something out of your shopping cart, right? I don't like going to the hospital or a doctor's office and not knowing what products are getting put in the bundle for me, right? So I don't know if that gives any more food for thought on what are your thoughts on these additional types of fees that get added to bills, and what's driving it? Like, I mean, I'm believing these people say this, Brian. So you tell me if this is not happening, right? I mean, do more of your providers tend to give a single flat fee, or do they like break it all out, right? Who wants to take this? I know I've thrown out a lot here.
Well, Brian's representing the entire industry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, part of the challenge is it's impossible to generalize across, service providers and how they do these things. I mean, I keep retreating back to this, but now with the broadband labels, providers are going to have to be required to break out both one-time and recurring fees that are part of the, the price of the service. I think one issue Mark may have touched on it, we've kind of danced around a little bit, is just that, it can be difficult to know exactly what information to include and what information is the essential information that a consumer needs to know in any particular context, whether that's an advertisement or the point of sale or somewhere else, especially when the price will vary from customer to customer based on legitimate things that, whether they're going to take a modem, whether there's some discount that applies, et cetera, et cetera. And it's impossible to capture all that variability on certain types of, on a broadband label, for instance. So I think there's a real kind of tension between sort of how much specificity can you provide and sort of allowing for a dynamic market where different options can be available for customers to meet kind of, different needs.
Yep. If I could add to that,
Please.
I spend a lot of time listening to businesses as well. And I'll use my wife as an example. She started a business 20 some years ago, very successful. She's really good at creating and running a business. And she and her executive team constantly struggle with, how do we present a price to a customer? They try different things, customers respond. They try something else, customers respond. Part of it is, how do customers actually make the decisions? What kind of discussions do you want to have with the customers? And then how do you get from where you are to someplace in the future? If you represented one price and things have changed, do you just change the price or do you add an element to the price? It's not an obvious decision on what it is. And I appreciate sitting outside the businesses and passing judgment on, well, they should do things this way or that way. When you're sitting in the seats, it's really hard to know. And chances are you're going to do a lot of things wrong. And that's why the industries are dynamic and keep changing how they do pricing.
Mm-hmm. So Jeff Kling asks or notes that in a simple world, the delivery of broadband consists of a three-legged stool. The owner of the infrastructure needs rent, the operator needs to recover monthly costs and profit, and the service providers, tenants, sell the services to the customers. Simplistic, but a universally accepted way of doing business. Does that, and this may hearken to a discussion we've had repeatedly and will be the theme of our digital infrastructure investment event, all in on open access, right? And in an open access world, you do truly have kind of like literally multiple players in this space. You can have a owner of the asset, a network operator, and then service providers. And Jeff's kind of laid out that whole vision, if you will. So I'm just wondering if people have any observations on, like returns to owners of assets, returns to operators, pricing. Does this framework or lens give any clarity or lack of clarity to the way pricing should be presented to consumers in the broadband marketplace? Jeff or Mike, do you want to weigh in on that?
I might pause on that particular question. I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that one of the things that we did not discuss or sort of touch on is that pricing is one element. In terms of broadband, predictability of the service you're buying is another one, right? Ookla was one of your sponsors. It made me think of it just when we started the thing. No one quite knows what they're paying for at this point. You might be paying for 800 meg or a gig. What are you getting? It becomes a bit of a challenging question.
Right.
I might be late in this conversation to go there. I apologize for bringing it up, but
no,
the two go together.
Well, and again, there's so many questions. I'm trying to balance getting questions.
Sorry about that.
We have another question about, the availability, or I should say the service quality, right? So like, we're probably talking less about this because I think providers have gotten better at sort of, hey, we're getting you close to what we're saying we're going to give you in terms of the speeds, and in general speeds are going up. But do you have any thoughts on this point? Brian, Mike, John, this particular question about are consumers getting what they're paying for when it comes to speeds and quality of service?
Well, I'll just say I do think speed and quality of service is a competitive differentiator. I do think providers compete on that basis to have them, the most consistent service. And I think providers that are deficient in that regard, they develop reputation and sort of kind of blowback for that. I think our members generally are providing fiber to the home and DOCSIS technologies. These are I think technologies that are proven to generally be high quality and provide service that's kind of consistent with what's being advertised. But then even going kind of retreating back once again, this is another area that's addressed on the broadband labels, the speeds and latency of the broadband service. So that's part of the disclosure that the customer will get.
And then building off of what Mike was saying, I've looked at a couple of situations with price. How important is price to the customer? Just a couple of experiences. I've not seen good studies of how the ACP is actually played out, but of all the other price discounts we've offered in the past for low-income households, we've learned that the price did not matter very much. What mattered was how did you engage with the customer to help them make sure this fit what they needed in their lives? It was that relationship that mattered a lot more than price did. We also did a study for Portugal several years ago now. The telecommunications regulator there had done a lot of surveys of customers and wanted us to analyze what can we learn from all these surveys. And one of the things that really surprised me was that when customers changed broadband providers, it had nothing to do with price. It had nothing to do with the technical quality of the service. It was how rudely were they treated by the customer representative. So those kinds of experiences with the customers matters a lot more than some of the things that we tend to think, oh, what we're going to focus on for regulation.
Good point, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of do agree with that. That is a big part of how consumers perceive things. And I think just one reason why, industry in some respects benefits from more transparent pricing, that does not hide fees on the bill is because it makes customers understand better. People want transparency in terms of pricing, just in terms of, okay, now I can shop around, I can find something else that doesn't do this, and that's fine. But sometimes if it's an unavoidable cost, at least it lets you know how to direct your ire. If you're, I think cable companies in particular have long, borne the brunt of consumer complaints that for costs that sometimes are really not in their control. And if those fees are hidden and disguised, and that applies to any kind of fee, broadband, across the board, consumers will just blame the company that is charging them the fee and then feel extra annoyed at it if it seems to be hidden from them in some way. Versus, just, hey, just want to let you know, when you're paying for us, here's where the money goes. And I do think that there is a benefit to industry from just having fairer and simpler pricing that people can easily understand, because it just leads to less confusion and less, consumer complaints.
I'm going to read one more question here and let our panelists use that or any other of the questions that have been asked that we haven't addressed as a springboard in final comments, and we'll just go in the same order that we started in. This is a question from Derek Zelkowski, and he points out that considering broadband internet adoption has how important it is, and how important it is for health, for educational attainment, for social and civic participation. This is singing our song, Better Broadband, Better Lives, right? Does this not mandate government involvement to ensure fairness in pricing to promote adoption? If not fairness, at least transparency. So that's Derek's question. You may answer that or any of the other questions that we've talked about during this 56 minutes so far. And let's give each of you a minute to offer some closing thoughts. So you're up first, Brian.
Sure. Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me today. Well, I'll say, look, I think some level of government involvement is pretty much inevitable. Providers, I think, have general obligations to be fair and non-deceptive in how they disclose their pricing. And on top of that, there are a number of, specific regulations that already apply to broadband providers, cable providers, other types of communications providers, and how they advertise and sell and market their services. I will just end by reiterating, the broadband market is a competitive one, and it's one where the competitive landscape is changing. It's a dynamic marketplace. Service offerings are always evolving, and I think it's just an area where we should be cautious about going beyond sort of the basic, the level of regulation that's already in place to adopt, additional requirements that could have unintended, counterproductive effects. Driving providers to limit their offerings, to not be able to provide, options and flexibility that could be available to could be the best choice for certain consumers in certain circumstances. So with that, thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Mike, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I would agree that dynamic and evolving is certainly true. I was reminded during the last few minutes of this conversation of how responsive the broadband industry was during COVID, right? Tremendous build out, lots of node splitting, lots of deployment of fiber to be responsive to increased demands from different sources, right? It was all commercial before COVID, and then all of a sudden residential broadband exploded during the day. So it was a huge challenge for them. In addition, when I believe at the time President Biden called for an affordable package from the industry, he got one from everybody, it seemed. I don't know if there were any exceptions, so it was remarkable.
It was President Trump at the time.
It was President, well, it was wrapped, I think, at Biden, but I might be wrong in my timing. Okay. What I am saying is that the industry, I think, was responsive at that time. I think there are still some gaps that need to get filled, and we will see that happen as BEAD implementation comes in a year or so.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the premise of Derek's question, and that, broadband is so important that seems to say, oh, shouldn't government be like extra involved here? But at the same time, I think a lot of the overall momentum we've had in tackling this in a more economy-wide manner, and from the White House and the FTC instead of just the FCC, has been about things like concert ticket fees or food delivery charges that seem deceptive. Those things are maybe not essentials of life in the same way as broadband is, but they really mobilize people to get people interested in the issue. So while I think that broadband deserves that kind of special attention, I wouldn't say that, for example, pricing action should be limited only to, these sorts of super essential services.
Well, great. And thanks for being with us. The last word will go to Mark Jameson. Round it out and bring us home here.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. I don't think it necessarily follows that if something's important, the government should be involved in how it's priced or how it's delivered or something like that. And it's because of my experiences in doing just that. If I am involved in how prices should be represented or be in an industry as a government employee, I think in terms of, okay, how does this work for me as an employee, as a bureaucrat, and how does it affect the political viability of my bosses? That not necessarily what is optimal for customers, especially at individual level. It won't be optimal for customers at an individual level. It's important. Customers will put the effort into it. They'll pay attention. They'll know a lot more about their situation than I would. And I'll wrap that up with underscoring the dynamic situation that we're in this particular industry. It's problematic if we lock in time how prices will be presented and structured, because that will keep people from, it'll make it costly for people to dynamically jump out of this particular framework into another one, because it's harder to get permission. It's harder to get the customer's attention for that. So we will slow down the innovations that might happen.
Well, it's been a great discussion. We want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Remind you that we are here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Don't miss it. On behalf of our great panelists, Brian Hurley, Mike Lynch, John Bergmeyer, and Mark Jameson, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.